For several years, I taught a course in Western religions for a couple of different colleges here in town. But in one of those colleges, the textbooks were predetermined by the academic dean. And so I faced a textbook, an online book, that I'd never seen before. My course covers Zoroastrianism to Judaism to Christianity and then Islam. And I thought the text was a little simplistic, but the students and I coasted along through their descriptions of the ancient Persian religion of Zoroastrianism, which influenced the development of the other three major Western religions. Judaism's history is more complex, but I found that I could at least live with the textbook's basic overview with some supplemental suggestions of my own. But when we started reading about what Christians believe, I objected to every single line. In fact, it's flat-footed assertion that Christians believe that their Bible is the perfect inspired Word of God, that Jesus was God's only divine Son, that Jesus accomplished salvation for believers through his death on the cross, saving adherents from an eternity in hell and delivering them to everlasting reward in heaven. I just kept trembling with anger. Some Christians believe those things, but many, if not most, would believe that those things are either archaic or at least metaphorical, that this is symbolic language, not to be taken literally. You wouldn't find any top-tier seminary teaching students that any of those things should be taken literally. Progressive Christians, at least, have always tried to describe their religion more in terms of orthopraxy, by practices of love, compassion, forgiveness, charity, community, but not that much about orthodoxy, of believing certain things. But the textbook version of the religion in which I grew up seemed to me like it was a caricature. It was an insult to my parents, the church I grew up in, all the pastors that I remember. Honestly, it was a gross distortion of what I have understood Christianity to be. The Christian religion is 2,000 years old, and the basic divisions of Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant hardly began to describe the differences among the 2 billion people who are grouped into one of the more than 45,000 different divisions of what it means to be Christian. Now, I personally identify as a Unitarian, more to give myself separation from my Christian neighbors here in the Ozarks than to cut myself off from the roots of my experience as a child or my education at Vanderbilt. I understand that I was teaching this course at a sophomore level for undergraduate students, but what this book said to my students about Christianity, from my perspective, gave them more to unlearn than it was teaching them that they should recall. And I can tell you, again, I've taught courses where, like one year I had the entire swim team from Drury University, all of whom were from Turkey, all of whom identified as Muslim, but they didn't know very much about Islam and they knew nothing about Christianity. It was as if they heard of Jesus when they walked into my classroom for the first time. But they did better on the test than the local people who had grown up going to Christian churches, because most of what they had learned was historically and theologically ridiculous. So when I looked at this course I was teaching for this college and all the things that were in that book, I thought, am I just mad about Christianity because I know more about it than the others? Was it just as wrong in how it describes Zoroastrianism and Judaism and Islam? I just don't know enough about those religions. Now, I think that's something that we have to be aware of within our own tradition, that if you grew up Baptist and someone else grew up Catholic, your view of Christianity is going to be pretty remarkably different. But this month, as we are talking about honoring indigenous nations of this continent, we really need to spend some time focusing on the history and heritage of these nations that we honestly don't know very much about. As a pastor and as a professor of world religions, I have come to realize that most of what modern Americans have to say about indigenous peoples, especially when they say something like Native American spirituality, is almost always either misleading at best, but oftentimes cartoonish. Not so much ancient wisdom from our First Nations as it is silly platitudes that people would, if you challenge them, say, well, I'm pretty sure I think I heard that somewhere, if not wisdom cracked fresh out of one of our fortune cookies at a local cashew chicken place. The indigenous communities have been on these continents since between 12 and 15,000 years ago. And of course, again, if you start reading textbooks on indigenous peoples, some are going to say 20 or 25,000. But let's go with the mainstream. 12 to 15,000 years of history. When they were here originally, these continents were still covered by woolly mammoths and the prehistoric cousins of both camels and horses. How can we dare to speak in a singular way of a spirituality among Indian nations that were here 10,000 years before Zoroaster was born, or Moses, or Jesus, or Muhammad? We assume that they migrated across the land bridge that existed in that time between what is now Siberia and Alaska. But they didn't all come at one time, and they didn't all come from one place. Over time, groups settled near the Arctic Circle, others spread across North and Central America, and even making their way out to the Caribbean islands and then down to the farthest reaches of South America. These hundreds of different tribes or nations evolved from hunter-gatherer societies towards more agrarian communities, and they did that at about the same time that our European and African ancestors were also evolving from hunter-gatherer societies to more agrarian societies. Some of the nations of South America developed elaborate written language with a shockingly accurate calendar, replete with very sophisticated awarenesses of astronomy. Northern tribes don't appear to have developed written languages that we know of, but they certainly did develop very complex social structures with different kinds of ways of supporting themselves. Some hunted more than others, some fished more than others, some farmed more. They developed weaving and pottery and many kinds of architecture. They didn't all live in wigwams or teepees. There were houses and row houses, and some lived in houses so large that 50 and 60 people lived in them. There was tremendous diversity from the Caribbean islands to what is now Canada to South America. Now, we can say that the Americas were discovered, to use that language, 3 different times. The first time by the indigenous who came here originally. There was a brief period of time in which there were Norse settlers in North America, but then the 15th century arrival of Christopher Columbus, that's the one we tend to know the most about. And the way historians originally wrote about it was that he had discovered Stone Age societies living here. I just find it objectionable to use that term because the whole Stone Age, copper, bronze, iron distinctions that we use for epochs of history in Europe don't necessarily apply to the New World, and they don't even really apply to Africa. Indigenous nations did make some jewelry out of scarce, softer metals, gold and silver, that they could get by panning in rivers the same way that prospectors were doing in the 19th century. But they didn't mine or manufacture copper, bronze, or iron. The prehistoric horses that would have greeted them when they first came across that land bridge eventually went extinct. They had no pack animals in the north. They did in the south. The llama and alpaca are actually relatives of the camel. And so in South America, the Mayans, the Aztecs, other Indian nations did have pack animals, but in the north they didn't. The indigenous tribes of the 15th century on this continent didn't use the wheel, they didn't have glass, they didn't have steel. In fact, although Columbus never actually set foot on the mainland of the Americas, the first tribes he did encounter in the Caribbean didn't know about what we call Native American spirituality, but by their reports, they had no religion at all. Now, this is a very important point for us all to let soak in. Our romanticized representations of Native American spirituality are, to put it lightly, almost entirely wrong. There were tribes that were more engaged in warfare, where they took spouses or servants from neighboring tribes, and others that were entirely peaceful. There were some that had fairly elaborate rituals around death, and others that just didn't. The first indigenous that the Europeans encountered seemed, as all reports from the diaries of Columbus's crew, to be beautiful, peaceful, and generous people who had their own social rules about family and marriage and ownership of property and work, which didn't have very much in common with the much more violent, greedy, and admittedly kind of rapey culture of their European visitors. While we know of religious rituals and beliefs among indigenous communities on the mainland, we need to recognize that they differ broadly from one another, and that not all indigenous nations had anything that we would recognize as religious rituals or spiritual beliefs. Theirs was not a primitive culture that was just discovered by European civilized Christians who then dominated them and tried to convert them. It was not an inferior culture replaced by a superior one. In fact, you could build a case, and I'm tempted to do it, that the islanders that Columbus encountered had the superior culture. They just didn't have swords. They didn't have guns. They didn't have metal knives. Columbus had promised his royal sponsors all the gold and silver they could ever use. We didn't find very much of that in the New World. So Columbus and his successors had to find a way to make money from these trips to the New World. And the way they made money was by capturing the indigenous as slaves, many of whom were children, and they were not just labor. They were taken home as sex slaves. Those who remained were enslaved to work for agricultural products that had high value in Europe. And that began a genocide that continued for most of the next 300 years. And I hesitate to say that it's still going on, but I was a part of the DAPL North Dakota protest on Sioux territory, and it looked like the genocide might still be going on. The introduction of African slaves to this continent then began to replace the labor of indigenous peoples, who had been almost entirely wiped out. Much of what we do know of this early era is from the records and observations made by the Spanish priest Las Casas, who came here as a layman and after seeing the abuses of the indigenous people became a priest. He lived on the island that is now home to both Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And according to his records, over 20 years of Columbus's supervision of that island, more than 3 million of the Indians had either been killed, shipped off into slavery, or had simply died in the mines and doing labor in the fields. Please consider this illustration. If we look at our own history, and then we think about, is there intelligent life on other planets? Many scientists have warned us that though we suspect that intelligent life exists in many places in the universe, I mean, it's a big universe and there's billions and billions of planets, Still, we shouldn't get too excited about the prospects of meeting any of them. Firstly, if they've got the technology to get here, which would require that they can travel faster than the speed of light, which is, as far as our physicists know, is absolutely impossible, then they would view us in much the way that Columbus viewed the natives that he encountered in the Caribbean. Civilizations have a way of exploiting those whom they find to be vulnerable, which we all would be under those circumstances. We might be more interesting to them as a food source than we would be for conversation. Europeans arrived in the Americas with guns and swords like aliens, searching for gold and silver, and finding little of that, decided to make their money out of slavery and sex trade. At the time of our much mythologized first Thanksgiving among English immigrants to the New World, there may have been 50 to 100 million indigenous peoples living in the Americas, probably around 25 million in what we now call the United States. They tremendously outnumbered the English. But as William Bradford recorded in his history written as events were unfolding, the English avoided encounters with the warriors from the Pequot tribes. They would wait till the warriors were away and then go in and kill the women and children and burn their village. In that way, they were taking away from the Pequots the will to fight. They chose instead a kind of terrorism in order to defeat the first indigenous tribes that we met. As one historian of the era observed, the Indians were terrified, and they learned 3 lessons from the Pequot Wars: that the English will tell any lie they have to tell for their own profit and ease, that they would fight mercilessly. Indians often fought with each other, but they didn't wipe each other out. But when the English attacked a tribe, they wanted to kill everyone and show no mercy. And finally, they had to realize that the weapons the English brought with them made them virtually impossible to defeat. Ironically, the white Europeans called the Native Americans savages. But the savagery that some of those tribes did exhibit later, we have to acknowledge historically, they learned from their invaders. The Western movement across this continent by English settlers was complicated, and they did encounter tribes that fought back and fought back hard. But within a century from that first Thanksgiving, 90% of the indigenous population was gone. 25 million at the beginning. A couple of million a century later. My own family settled in southern Kentucky in the late 1700s. And the 200 years later, even still as a child, when I would walk across the fields that had been freshly plowed on the family farm, it was not difficult to find evidence of the Indian population that had lived there for hundreds and hundreds of years. As you can see, once introduced to the bow and arrow, natives replaced their flint spears with delicately made arrowheads, some smaller than a quarter, an amazing tribute to how quickly native cultures adapted to the innovations they learned from interactions with European settlers. And yes, I have looked into donating my own small collection to a museum in Kentucky, and I can tell you, since you can still go out and find thousands of these flint points all over the state, they are nearly worthless to museums. These are probably between 300 and 600 years old, and as native history goes, that's just a flash in the pan. If we were to excavate on my family farm, heaven knows what all we would find from a 10 to 15,000 year occupation. The maps we often see, especially in social media, displaying where tribes lived in North America are almost as bogus as the shaman who tried to tell us what Native American spirituality was like. When you see one of those maps, they present boundaries of native tribes in a way that you might look at a map of modern Europe. But you have to know, when you look at a map of modern Europe, it has been constantly changing for the last 10,000 years, just as the map of where the indigenous lived in North America for the last 10,000 years. It's impossible to do this accurately, but these two academic maps give us some impression of the placement of different cultures at the time, initially in the first map when Columbus arrived in the Americas, and then when the English began to settle on the East Coast 300 years later. The tribes moved, and some of them moved a lot. Their numbers would grow and diminish based on diseases and growing seasons and the availability of meat from different species. At the time my family arrived in Kentucky, there were still Cherokee, Chickasaw, Shawnee, Yuki, and several other indigenous tribes living all around them. Now, for a lot of us, the word Cherokee comes to mean almost the same thing as Indian. The origins of the Cherokee, however, were probably on the East Coast, and they began to move west to get away from the violent white Europeans they were encountering. Those that did try to remain in their ancestral lands were eventually removed, most famously by Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act, which most of us now simply refer to as the Trail of Tears. Still, in spite of how many people talk about it, of the 60,000 indigenous people moved to Oklahoma in the Trail of Tears, just 15,000, just a fourth of them, were actually Cherokee. But of that number, 4,000 died in transit, and some Cherokee reports say that number could have been as high as 8,000. It was the intention of General Winfield Scott, as he drove the Trail of Tears forward, to kill off as many Indians as he could by the process of removal. But with each forced relocation, we simultaneously erased indigenous history, culture, even religion. Some tribes evidently were so despondent about how they were being wiped out by European diseases that they simply left their religious artifacts behind when they abandoned their villages because they believed their gods had abandoned them. But in all of this westward push and in all of the genocide that happened, we've lost the names of many tribes, as well as their languages and their culture. When I have taught Western religion courses, I try to make sure that my students understand how the form of Judaism that existed prior to their exile in the Babylonian kingdom in the 5th century BCE bears almost no similarity to the Judaism that came out of Babylon to reestablish their nation once they had been liberated. Judaism emerged from captivity. They were there for 40 to 80 years, but they had combined their ancient Hebrew stories with very Zoroastrian beliefs in things they had never heard of before, like heaven and hell and angels. And believe it or not, Judaism started out as one of many polytheistic religions, but they came out of Babylon with a more monotheistic view. Not because of anything Moses said, but what they had learned from Zoroastrian priests. Now, not to get into your business, but you might not want to bring this up to your evangelical relatives at Thanksgiving this week. Still true. The religions of the indigenous tribes evolved quickly in light of the devastation of their numbers by the Europeans. Some of the best-known native authors writing about indigenous spirituality are people who actually grew up in Catholic boarding schools, and they report on their visions, which, again, has its own merit at the time that it's written, but you cannot take that as a serious description of what indigenous spirituality would have been like before they encountered Catholic boarding schools, as well as all of the influence of the priests, particularly the Jesuits, that came to convert the Indians. Frankly, it is hard to know who to believe, because even the most acclaimed academic books on Native history disagree with each other very broadly. At a bare minimum, what I'm asking of everyone in my audience who grew up in North America is that we need to interrogate our beliefs about the indigenous cultures of this stolen land. This isn't about feeling guilty. It isn't about trying to rewrite history. It's about accepting that most of the impressions that we have formed from our childhood educations about the indigenous is comprised of balloon juice. And the beginning of honoring these people's culture is to stop repeating silly lies and even the romantic imagined stories that we learned as children. We need to apply more of a critical race theory approach to our understanding of Native culture, just as we need to understand it about slave culture and African American history. But still, there are a few things that can be said about indigenous culture, if not their spirituality, some of which really ought to be sobering to us. For example, as historian Gary Nash observed about the Iroquois, they didn't have police. They didn't have jails. They didn't have a court system, no judges, no juries. They managed crime through community intervention, that the entire community would help to correct someone who had made a mistake, usually successfully restoring them fully to relationships with the rest of the tribe. There was no one being exiled or executed, which was a lot easier to do since they didn't have a huge income and wealth gap between the rich and the poor in Indian tribes. Property was generally community owned. You have to realize that in European culture, the mere existence of police and jails and court systems is fundamentally to protect the haves from the have-nots. Appreciating indigenous culture first means that we have to stop looking down on them and treating them as if they were somehow inferior to European culture. They most assuredly were not. They were different, and in terms of technology, they were several steps behind Europe, but in terms of family, decency, compassion, justice, mercy, they were arguably way ahead of my tribe. So with open minds and sincere curiosity, let's set aside the stereotypes and prejudices and try to make some real progress in understanding the diversity that is America in the 21st century by trying to understand where we all came from.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.